Hello everyone. Looks like we're live. Yes, I'm Paula. And I'm Daniel. We work at Big Deaf as access coordinators. We support deaf people in applying for the NDIS and also pre-planning. So we support clients along the way. We have quite a bit of experience that we've had over the last year or so. So we thought we could talk about any issues you may have about interpreting for the NDIS. Experience that we've had over the last year. We work here at Big Deaf, and our roles here are responsible to going out into the deaf community and sharing information sessions about the NDIS. So we do work for Big Deaf, but we do have an interpreting agency here called Auslan Connections. Our information tonight is very neutral, and in general it's very neutral. We don't take sides for who we're promoting to deliver your interpreting services. So we just want to make sure that you know about that, and we're here to talk about the interpreting under the NDIS. And if there's anything that we can't answer tonight, we will make sure to record your questions and respond to them later. So even if you think we haven't replied, we will down the track. You can see that 13 people are watching us. If you could just say hello so we know where you are. Did you want to talk about our past experiences so far? Yes, so Big Deaf have been involved with the NDIS in Barwon. So that's Geelong. That's where the trial site was, and we learned a lot from that experience. It is now rolled out in northeast Melbourne, and also in Big Deaf has also had a presence there and really learned what's happened on the ground in the NEMA region and also in Tasmania, because Big Deaf and Tasmania have merged. So we have learned about what's happening in the Tasmanian context as well, and our experiences we're sharing tonight is what we've learned along the way. You can see Cherie said hello. Hi, Cherie. Daniel and I did a lot of community information sessions. So we had people come into those forums, and we've also had one-on-one sessions where we've shared information with people and gone through the process before they go to a planning meeting. So because it is such a new system, most people haven't experienced it so far. So it's great to have that preparation before you go to those planning meetings. You may have already done that and you want to know how to improve for next time. So tonight's a great opportunity for us to share that information. So we will be talking and discussing different things we've learned along the way, but please feel free to ask questions throughout the evening. We're happy to answer your questions to the best of our abilities. So if you can ask us any questions at any stage throughout the evening. Our focus is, of course, about interpreting in the NDIS package and what that looks like, how you can best access interpreting under the NDIS. If it's successful, tonight's session, we may do future sessions on different topics. We may do other specific areas for the NDIS if there's interest. So Paula, would you like to talk about interpreting and how it works under the NDIS and what our community should be thinking about? Yes, there are deaf people out there who aren't too sure about interpreting, what they can use interpreters for, where they can access the interpreters, when, at how much should they be paying, how to ask for interpreters. So I think everything is really new. The most easiest thing to keep in mind is that you need to work out over the past year, how many times did you use interpreters? And if you work out how many hours and in what scenarios, then you can access interpreting through the NDIS package. Maybe you haven't been able to because, maybe you've never had to because medical appointments have always been covered and ETH has covered workplace interpreting, but maybe you want to go to a family gathering or you want to go to a community course and you haven't been able to access interpreters. The NDIA may provide interpreting for that, but you may want to ask some more of the finer details. So we want to make sure that we answer questions that you want to know, not what we think you want to know. It seems to be there's a question. It says, so if I want to see a counsellor, maybe the counsellor's at Big Deaf or another counsellor, so a private booking, we've had a question here that says, does the NDIS will provide interpreting costs and also pay for the counselling session? How does that work, Paula? The NDIS, if it's in your plan that said you want interpreters for counselling, then you can have that covered in your plan. The counsellor's fee, it really does depend on whether or not it's listed on your plan. If the counselling is in relation to your hearing loss, maybe your frustrations about being deaf or the grief that you've faced being deaf, then the counselling cost may be covered. But if it's a family issue and it's something completely unrelated to your disability, then that is something you'll have to pay for out of your own pocket. There seems to be another question here. There's a focusing problem. Yeah, but it looks pretty clear on our end. There's autofocus on the camera that we're using here. Apologies for that. We have a question here. It's asking, can we please look at the camera? Yeah, because we're looking at the screen. Apologies for that. We'll keep that in mind. Another question here is with the EAF, the Employment Assistance Fund. Will that continue as is, or will it be absorbed by the NDIS? At the moment, it will stay as they are. They'll be separate and it will not be absorbed by the NDIS. So if you need interpreting at work, it stays under the Employment Assistance Fund. Your personal socialising skills or any skill improvement sessions you may do is separate. But maybe one day the EAF may be absorbed by the NDIS, but at the moment it currently stands alone and they're separate. EAF focuses on workplace adjustments. You may need equipment at work. The NDIS can focus on other equipment for your house or where you may live. In your office, you may need a doorbell, you might need a flashing light, so you might need the same at home. So you can organise EAF for the workplace doorbell and NDIS for your personal home alerts. What's also great about the NDIS is that EAF in the past, when you got into that scheme, you had to work over 8 hours. So people who volunteered or worked on a casual basis and worked under 8 hours a week couldn't access EAF. But now with the NDIS, you are able to get that covered. If you're volunteering or you go to a program or your children attend a program and you go to volunteer and support, now the NDIS enables you to have access with interpreters using funds there. Or casual work, if you work casually under 8 hours a week, the NDIS can cover anything you may need there. So there are overlaps throughout. It is really important you do raise this in your planning meeting, your future career aspirations, what skills you want to develop, and ensure that they are listed as your goals in your plan so that you can ensure the planner includes funds for that. We have another question. The question here is, can interpreters be used, can NDIS funds be used to pay for interpreters for a community course? We believe it can. If it's in your plan, like I've said earlier, you need to be very well prepared. So make sure you are prepared. Make sure you list what goals you want to achieve throughout your life. If you want to study a course, it could be gardening, it could be sewing, it could be anything that's held at a community centre. TAFE or university have their own interpreting processes, but in neighbourhood house events or anything that is in that sort of environment, and you're interested in learning at a community centre, then interpreters can be provided there, which is great because in the past that hasn't been the case and there's been barriers in accessing community courses. So now with the NDIS, it's opened so many doors for us in the deaf community. And you might think about what your neighbours can do and what you can't do, and then now you have access to do that. You have the right to access whatever your neighbours are accessing. Now it looks like we have 28 people viewing. They've joined us this evening. Welcome. Paula and I were talking before about who we are. So I'm Paula and I'm Daniel. This is Paula next to me. So we might just wait for a few more questions to come up on the screen and we'll answer your questions. And the focus is on interpreting with the NDIS. There is another new question here. Can we have interpreters at weddings? Yep, absolutely we can. Now, people aren't sure what they can use NDIS funds for because it is so new. In the past, we've never experienced being able to use interpreters in these situations. And now with the NDIS, you can in weddings, parties, 21sts, 50ths, anything that's related to your your family, your social life, any community events. An example of that may be, as your goal, you want to really get to know your family better. You want to improve family relationships so that you can support each other. And when you go to a wedding, you can have interpreters there, so you can really get to know your family members that are there. And it's worthwhile having interpreters there. It's not a luxury. It's actually that it's worthwhile for you, and it's beneficial for yourself and your family. Usually you go to weddings and you miss the speeches and you get the speech notes after, but then you can actually finally enjoy the speech at the same time as you're hearing relatives. There's another question here. So we have a question here. Additional technology and devices. This is a separate topic. So tonight we are focusing on interpreting in NDIS packages, but if you do need an OT assessment, we can have a further conversation with you offline. I think this question isn't relevant for tonight, but it is worthwhile getting in contact with us. And we have a pre-planning team. There's Daniel, myself, and a few other staff members who are more than happy to assist you. There's another question here. NABs. So what's happening with NABs? Will that be absorbed by the NDIS? Deaf people who regularly use NABs for interpreters, if you're living in a rollout area, NABs are funded by the government for medical appointments under, of course, the business they operate under NABs. That funding will cease. So the money will then go to you in your package. And then you can decide if for your interpreters for your medical appointments, and you don't have to go to NABs. You can use any interpreting agency you prefer. The NDIA goal is always, it's your choice and control. So you're right, it's no longer free under NABs with the medical interpreting if you do live in a rollout area. But it's great now you have the choice of choosing interpreters from organisations that you feel comfortable with. Now those over 65, it stays as is, they can use NABs. Anyone who is under 65 and lives in the rollout area and has a package, you have to start listing it in your plan, and then you, like Paula said, it's up to your discretion who you use for interpreting. If you want to continue using NABs, you can. NABs will then just take that funding out of your accounts, out of the money that out of your package. And likewise with other interpreting agencies, that money will come out of the package that you received from the NDIS. We have a comment here that says their plan wasn't very great and the interpreting allocation they got was very low and they weren't happy. So they had to contact the NDIA and let them know they weren't happy and ask for a review. This is something that we've seen happen to quite a few people. And this is why it's so important, like Paula said, that you have to really consider what you want in your plan. You need to really consider how many hours of interpreting you've used over the last year and try and think ahead about how many interpreting hours you'll use in the year ahead of you. It's not something we've had to do before, but you need to list every single detail you can possibly think of. And you may need to make sure that all the information is in there so that the planner looks at what you need and they can list that and they can include that. If you go into a meeting and you don't give them all the information, you might get limited hours for interpreting. So we're more than happy for you to come into Big Def and have a conversation with us and in the pre-planning cycle. It's really important you do really consider what you want before you go. You need to think about how many hours for medical interpreting you think you'll need, how many hours for family events, anything community events, socially, and any maybe community courses you'd like to attend. So you can have funding for interpreters for those 3 different scenarios. Another question. So what happens if I run out of funds for interpreting? I can't access health services. If your health deteriorates and becomes quite serious, you can contact the NDIS and let them know your situation has changed and your health has deteriorated and you need to go to the doctors a lot more often. So you can ask for a review where you can ask for more money to be topped up in your interpreting funds to ensure you can still access health services. Another question, are all different interpreting agencies able to provide interpreters for medical situations? And the answer is yes. All of the agencies that are available can provide interpreters for medical appointments. It's completely your choice. You can go with the organisation you feel comfortable with. The agency that book the interpreters will ensure they have the appropriate skill set to interpret the medical situation. You can ask for your preferred interpreters if that's your wish. There's another question here that says, how often do you have to apply for the NDIS? Is it every year? Is it when your money runs out? And that's a great question. So when you receive your NDIS package, it will last for a year. Just before that year is up, you will need to meet again with the planner, have a conversation about the year that has passed and how your funding was, if you need more or less, and then that will again run for another year. So it is a yearly cycle. If the money runs out, unfortunately, you have to wait until the end is coming, and then you can ask for a review of you, or you can do your plan again. If you can't wait, you can ask for a review to have a look at your situation. But it is important to balance your money and make sure you use it appropriately. But remember, if you have money left over, don't think, oh, I'll keep that for next year, because it will go back to the NDIA at the end of the year. And then they will look at your situation and say, well, you didn't use all your money last year, so they may give you less. So if you make sure that you do use your money and you explain why you're using your money, then you can be appropriately allocated those funds. Sometimes you want to book interpreters directly. You don't want to go through agencies. Is that, someone's asking me, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because sometimes, you know, you're not sure about what insurance covers. And that's a very interesting question. And it really varies. It's up to you. It's your choice. You can go through interpreting agencies, or you can go to interpreters direct. If you do book interpreters direct, you must keep in mind, does the interpreter have insurance, or do you need to have insurance? You need to make sure that is entirely clarified before you book the interpreters. What's your cancellation policy? What is the criteria in booking the particular interpreters? Ensure that is all crystal clear before you do go direct to interpreters. It's interesting about when you go through interpreter agencies or direct with interpreters, everything does depend on how your money is managed. So if you've been approved for the NDIS and you get your package, your plan, there are 3 different ways you can manage your funds. So one way is the government manages your funds, so the NDIA look after your money. You may do it yourself. You may self-manage your funds and you pay invoices and you organise everything yourself. Or you may do it through a financial third planner, third person, which is called plan managed. So there are 3 different scenarios, and there are the pros and cons to all of them. But in terms of interpreting, if you are managed by the NDIA, then you can only book interpreters through people who are registered as NDIA service providers. So many interpreting agencies out there have registered as service providers, but individual interpreters, there are very few that have registered. There's a lot of paperwork involved and many interpreters haven't. So if you are NDIA managed, it means that you can book interpreters using interpreting agencies. If you are self-managed and you look after your own funds, or if you do it through if you're plan managed, it is more flexible. So you can book with anyone who's registered with the NDIS or people who are unregistered. So you can use anyone. So that means that you might be able to book an interpreter through an agency, or you can book individuals, because most of the individual interpreters aren't registered. So there is a bit more flexibility there. So it really does come back to how your funds are managed out of those 3 options. It is really worthwhile considering, because it can be quite confusing the first time. It's all new information and you really need to understand every single part of those 3 options. It has implications on yourself and interpreting, so it's best to really consider your needs. if you want to book interpreters directly or through agencies, you do need to consider weigh the pros and cons to both. If you book an interpreter directly, like Daniel mentioned before, you are responsible for insurance. If something happens or the interpreter is sick, then you have to yourself try and find another interpreter who's available to come and do the booking. If you do it through an agency, then the insurance is covered. If the interpreter is sick, it's on the agency to try and find a replacement, and there's less stress on your part there. But it really comes down to you and what you want and what your choice is. Hopefully that's answered that question. So we have another question on the screen here. We're just looking at that now. What happens if you go to a different, if you're in a different state, can you ask for the interpreters as well? You can book interpreters wherever you are in Australia. You do need to consider transport as well. If you want a specific interpreter from another state to fly to your state, then you need to take in mind the travel. It may be best to say, oh, well, I'm in this state, so who's the nearest interpreter that can come with me to the appointment, rather than spending all of your NDIS money on travel. Or if I lived in New South Wales and I had an interpreter that I preferred in Victoria, and I'm on holidays and I really want that particular interpreter, you can always use technology. You can use VRI interpreting, video remote interpreting, and still engage that same interpreter. So there are a few different options. People get into the habit of thinking that interpreters have to be here in person, but now with technology, you can have access to interpreters on your iPad, on your laptops, on your phone. So if you are in a regional area, or there's no interpreters available in the time that you need, or there may be traffic, then you can do that. I think you can book for a maximum of 30 minutes. It depends on each agency. Some are 20-minute minimums, which saves you money as well. Very worthwhile having the option and just really doing your research and seeing what's going to suit you best. It really depends on the situation and what's happening on the day for you. So another question here is, if I book with an interpreting agency and it's cancelled, does the agency charge me and then I have to pay? Can I claim that to the NDIS? That's an interesting question. What's really important with interpreting agencies or interpreters directly, or interpreting individuals, you need to ensure that you do have a contractual agreement. It's in the registration, everything is listed clearly about the cancellation policy. If something does happen and there's a cancellation, and then it says in the cancellation policy that you have to pay, then you can go to the NDIA and follow that process. You do have to provide proof and ensure that it was cancelled and not just randomly pay anything. So you can claim that and then they'll pay that. Some cancellation policies are 24 hours, 48 hours. It really is important to make sure you look at your service agreement and your contract and ensure that you have listed that information in there. Another question here, I want to go to an overseas event with my family. Can I Skype with an interpreter from Australia? Yeah, absolutely. With VRI, you can use Skype, or you can do video conferencing, or even through your iPad. Technology is amazing. Hopefully you have a good enough connection wherever you are, depending on the country you're in. You may need to trial it before the actual event. The time difference is something you need to keep in mind. Maybe the interpreter has to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and all groggy. They have to try and interpret, but if everyone's happy, then it works. Another here is I have to book interpreters for 1 hour's to 2 hour minimum. Yeah, it's interesting, and that is correct. Most interpreters now are booked for a 2 hour minimum, so they're paid for the 2 hour minimum even if the booking's a 1 hour job. So it depends on the organisation in the service agreement, like Paula mentioned. Does it state there's a 2 hour minimum, or you can perhaps negotiate to have a different minimum rate? You can have those conversations and see if the person you're negotiating with is willing to change that. The NDIA are really encouraging people to think differently and encouraging people to do things in a new way, not to get stuck in old habits. So whether it's interpreting agencies or interpreting individuals, see if you can negotiate a 1 hour minimum, or if it has to be a 2 hour minimum. I know there are instances where you go into an appointment, it's only 15 minutes and you still have to pay for the 2-hour minimum. But again, you can use VRI, which is more flexible, like Daniel said before. You can book interpreting for 20 minutes minimum on VRI. So it may be more worthwhile doing it like that if that's something that works for you. It's also very important to consider when you do have that conversation with the planners that you talk about your goal, your barriers, and what your needs are, and that you also explain with interpreting there is a 2-hour minimum. And so then you can work out how many hours that really equates to. So you might think you only need 40 hours, but you might need 80. You might need to double it because of the 2-hour minimum. And that's something that the NDIA planners may not be aware about. So if you think about that, then hopefully that leads to more funds for you to stretch that further. It's another question here. If I book through an agency, do I have to pay for 2 interpreters for a long appointment? Yes, you do. If it's over 2 hours, you will need 2 interpreters. And really, interpreters have considerations they need to keep in mind in terms of OHS and their own personal safety. So that's why you need to have 2 interpreters to prevent those injuries. Another question here is, if your interpreter is sick, will the interpreter agency look for a replacement? Yep, like they've always done, they will continue to do that. If your interpreter is sick, the interpreting agency will do their best to find a replacement for you. If you've booked through an interpreter agency, you have that backup. But if you do book directly with your interpreter and that interpreter is sick, then that may mean that you end up in a sticky situation where you're left with no one. Other questions here is, can Victorian interpreters fly down to Tasmania and do that being paid by the NDIS? Yes, we know that Tasmania don't have a lot of interpreters, so interpreters from Victoria can go to Tasmania. But if you do want that, you do have to consider the travel time that you will have to pay. The best thing to do would be to contact the interpreter agency and try and negotiate and make certain agreements before you go ahead with that. You're right. I think every single situation will be different depending on each individual. Everyone's needs different, and there's no harm in talking to the agents, to the interpreting agency, and just seeing what you can agree upon. So another question here is, what other things can deaf people use funds for the NDIS? The access for their hearing children? Yeah, so if you are deaf and you have hearing children and they have a concert that they go to, rather than sitting there in the audience board and seeing all the other parents enjoying the tunes that your children are singing, you can have interpreters at those events so that you can understand what your children are singing and dancing to. Or the kids may go to a birthday party for their school friends, or a 1-year-old birthday party, 2-year-old birthday party, and in the past there's never been interpreters, so the parents may not go, or they may play with the children rather than socialise with the other parents. With the NDIS, you can access funds, so then you can have conversations with other parents. Just looking at the questions, there's a question. It asks here, who provides the iPads for VRI interpreting? In the past, it has been each individual person's responsibility to have your own iPad, or if you go to a community centre or somewhere that has shared local computers like a library, it's generally each individual is responsible in providing their own technology. Someone's asked another question here. If you have an appointment with a lawyer, maybe there's been a death in the family and there's negotiations that need to happen about the will, absolutely. The NDIS's aim is to ensure that you are inclusive, that you're on an even playing field with your hearing counterparts. Maybe you want to be more independent, you want to access information on your own, you don't want to rely on another family member to go with you for those conversations, and you want to have those conversations in private. The NDIS will provide interpreting for that, as long as you do have those conversations in the planning meetings. But that is, your private life means that you should be able to manage things smoothly, and you should be able to have interpreters at things like will discussions, because you're right, in the past there's never been that opportunity. So it means there's more access. Another person here says, I'm deaf and blind, I use tactile interpreting. Using VRI would be too hard because the iPad is too small. That's right. If it's not an option that suits you, you may need to think about the best way that suits you. Maybe it means you need technology, or you might need interpreters to come in face-to-face for tactile interpreting. Just looking at the other questions here. If the interpreter's sick or the interpreter's running late, can someone let you know? Yes, I think usual practice is if you book interpreters using an interpreting agency, the agency will let you know that the interpreter's sick or that they're running late. If you book interpreters directly, then and the interpreter's sick, maybe they can't answer you, or if they're late, you should still get information regardless of where you booked your interpreter. Another question here is, can the NDIS provide interpreting for my business? That's a great question. Like earlier, we had that question about the Employment Assistance Fund. So EAF is still separate from the NDIS. The NDIS is more for social and personal interactions, or for your home life, to access services so that you can have access just like everyone else in the community. Your own business, you potentially can get interpreters in place to help you if you're going to a training course or a skill development course. If you want to go to the lawyer to talk about your business, or you want to go to see a financial advisor. We have seen someone who is deaf and has their own business in Geelong, and they're going great guns. Everything's really going smoothly because of help from the NDIS. You do need to ensure you list it as your goals in your plan. And with your business, you need to explain what it is that you want to achieve. And that may ensure that interpreting costs are covered there. You need to talk about the aims of your business, but also why that's an aim and what barriers you currently face, and how having NDIS funding can overcome those problems, and how having interpreters can help you be successful in your business venture. If you work over 8 hours every week, then you can use EAF for regular interpreting from that point on. Worthwhile trying both avenues and seeing what response you get. It's a very good point, Paula. The NDIS is very new and there's a lot involved. So there's no harm in trying, seeing how you go. It's only still in its infancy, and everyone needs time to really get used to the process, and then we'll know exactly what we can use it for and what we can't use NDIS funds for. So there's absolutely no harm in asking. The worst they can say is no. There's a question here that's asked, I want to know how many days in advance I need to book interpreters. Is it 2 weeks? Is it less than that? Most interpreting agencies' preference is that you book 2 weeks in advance because the supply and demand is outweighed. So if you want to know, if you know you've got an appointment coming up, then it's worthwhile booking interpreters straight away. If it's a last-minute interpreter request and the interpreting agency can't find you interpreters, then you can look around at other agencies. It's important that in your service agreement, in your contract you have with each agency, that you know that they have access to your NDIS number and they can take out those funds for any appointments you've requested. So we have a question here. If I get a plan and I'm not happy and I need to change my plan, can I appeal that decision, or is there a limited number of times I can appeal? You can appeal as many times that you want. The only thing to consider with appeals, it can take a long time. It can take 2 or 3 months to finally get a response and to have that conversation and to do those negotiations. So please do keep that in mind. The NDIS wants to make sure that everything works smoothly. So if you're not happy, of course, ensure that you do appeal. But hopefully once you've appealed once, everything is sorted out and you shouldn't need to appeal again. So we've got a question here. If a deaf person goes overseas and you want to use a local interpreter or a BSL interpreter, I think the NDIS, if your funds are self-managed, then you can book any interpreter, whether they're from Australia or whether they're a local interpreter in the country that you're in. You need to get the invoice and ensure that you have that proof. But the funds, if they're agency managed, then the interpreter has to be registered as a provider with the NDIS. So then that would mean that it would be a local Australian interpreter. There's another question here. Can I book interpreters directly? And that's a great question. Earlier we mentioned that you can book interpreters directly or you can go through interpreting agencies. It does depend on how your funds are managed. So I'll go through that again. There are 3 different ways your funds can be managed. They can be managed by the NDIA, self-managed by yourself, or they can be managed through a separate organisation. There are pros and cons to each of them in terms of interpreting. If it's managed by the NDIA, then you need to book if you want to book interpreters. Any interpreters or agencies you want to use interpreters with must be registered with the NDIS. They must have all the paperwork done, and then you can book interpreters individually or through agencies. If your funds are self-managed or if they're plan managed, then it's more flexible. So you can book with whoever is registered, but also who's not registered with the NDIS. So most interpreters who are freelance interpreters are not registered because there is a lot of paperwork to go through. So if you would like to book directly with interpreters, it is best to consider how your funds are managed. It may be that you self-manage your funds or that they're plan managed. So if you do want to book interpreters directly, then you can do it there. Like we mentioned earlier, you do need to consider the risks and the pros and cons to each of those 3 options. If you book interpreters directly and they are sick or something happens, they have an accident on the way, it won't be that easy to find a replacement interpreter. If you do it through an interpreting agency, if the interpreter is sick, then the interpreting agency then takes on the responsibility of finding a replacement. That's right, booking interpreters directly then means that you are their boss. So who's responsible then for taking out tax and for insurance? You need to ensure everything is clear from the get-go. You don't want to just rush into things and then find that there are issues later on down the track. You need to ensure everyone's on the same page and that everything is clear. You need to make sure you have those contracts with each individual person, the cancellation clause, how many hours is it cancelled until I don't have to pay, or how much do I have to pay if they're sick. So it goes back to your choice and your control. It really is your decision. So there's another question here. It says, if I want to go on a cruise for 10 days and I need an interpreter to come on the cruise, do I have to cover their travel and their food costs for the 10 days? Daniel. It's a very interesting question. The NDIS's perspective on that is they will only pay for the interpreting time. So you would have to negotiate with the interpreter how that would work. Maybe everyone who's deaf who's on that cruise can share the costs, or the interpreter themselves may be willing to, on the same time they're having a bit of a holiday, they can also pay their own flights and their own food costs. The work they do through those hours they're actually interpreting will be paid. So it's up to you with how you manage that. But the NDIS in general, their view is that they don't cover food or transport for things like that, or airfares for things like cruises. So you may need to think about different ways to work around that and just be a bit creative. It's now 7:40 and we have 50 people joining us tonight, which is fantastic. We've had some fantastic questions coming through. Hopefully you're happy with the information you're receiving, and please feel free to keep bringing the questions to us. People are still unsure whether or not they can get interpreters for all different scenarios. There's such a habit of knowing that I can get interpreting for studying and for doctor's appointments and for work, but that's it. But now you can have access for parties, for community courses, holidays. I think people are quite taken aback by that, and they're not used to the idea of it. So the world is your oyster. Maybe even if you go to the mechanic and you want to have a conversation about your car, the engine may not be working properly, or you want to go to the hairdresser and have a conversation about the next hairstyle that you want. It's really up to you and what your aims are in your life. I remember the NDIS plan. Usually with the plan, it says how many hours you have for interpreting, or budgeted hours. So how many hours for 1 year, and so you'll spend 40 hours on medical appointment. Medical is important. Hairdressing may not be as important. It depends on you. It's up to you what you feel is important to you, and where you will want interpreters to be used the most in your day-to-day life. That's right. It's really important to get your plan, and when you get your plan, really sit down and work out exactly how you want to spend your money to avoid disappointment when your funds do run out. Ensure that you know how much a particular job will cost you, and don't rush through. Ensure you know everything that's in your plan. And don't assume that the NDIS will just automatically review your plan if you've run out of money. If you've had a huge life change and something's happened, then they will consider it. But if you just spend your money willy-nilly, they'll be less considerate. So we can't guarantee that that funding will definitely be topped up if you ask for a review with the NDIS. I do suggest you have conversations with your other deaf people and ask what they've learned in the process if they've got plans. Not everyone will get the same. Everyone is so different. So don't assume because your friend got a certain amount of money that you will get the same amount of money, because that won't happen. It will vary depending on each individual person. But it is worthwhile having conversation with your friends for ideas. They may have ideas and you may never have thought of them. It's new for everyone. Like I said before, you need to think about how many hours you're going to need through the year ahead of you. You think about how many appointments you go to, whether it's a dentist, GP, a physio, anything that's medical related. And then think about how many community related events. It could be family birthdays, weddings, community festivals that you want to have a look at, theatre that you want to attend. Or it may be for learning purposes. You may want to study at a community centre or take up a new hobby. You might want to do gardening or sewing, and you want to learn some more new skills. So add all of those hours up and ensure you are very well prepared before you meet with the planner. And that planner, when you sit with them, will remember it's the 2 hours for the interpreting minimum. So ensure that you do keep that in mind when you ask for how many hours. And if you can negotiate that, then that's great. If you do want to attend a community course, and it's a 10-week community course, and it's 2 or 3 hours every week, there may be online a schedule that you can print and take with you to your planning meeting to show them the course that you're interested in attending. So then you have more proof. You can bring information, and the more information you bring, the more valuable that will be, because it's proof to show what you're interested in doing. You may want to go to basketball training, and you may have your schedule, and you can ask your coach to write down how many times you will be meeting to train, and then you can take that letter to the planner to prove that you are attending basketball training. And community courses, now you do still need to pay for the fees. That is still your responsibility, but the NDIS will pay for the interpreting. So the NDIS will not cover both the cost of the course and also the interpreting. Yeah, that's right, Paula. You might want to lose some weight and get into shape. You might want to go down to the gym, and you might say to the NDIS, oh, I want interpreting. But you can do that, but the NDIS will not pay for your gym membership, because your hearing counterparts also pay for their own gym membership. Where the barrier is access and not having communication access with your personal trainer. So that's where the interpreter will be covered by the NDIS, but your gym membership will be paid by yourself. You might never go to the gym because you can't use a personal trainer because you don't have access, and you might now be able to use a personal trainer for 4 times and then not need the interpreting anymore. You train on your own. I might even do it, who knows? It doesn't look like there's any further questions. Daniel and I have pre-prepared some questions that have come across us at different information sessions. So if things are all quiet in Facebook, we might just add a few more of those questions to share with you now. Someone asked us a question in those sessions if they can book Auslan interpreter and a deaf interpreter. And the answer is absolutely yes, depending on your needs. If you need more visual communication and you get that using deaf interpreters, then absolutely. It is important that if you need that, you do explain that at your planning meeting. You explain that you need a hearing interpreter and a deaf interpreter so that they ensure that is worked out in your plan to ensure you have enough money. Everything depends on you as the individual and what needs you have and how you tell your story. That's right. There's another question here that says, I live in the east and I live in an NDIS rollout area, but my brothers are deaf and they live in the west and they don't live in a rollout area as yet. If I organise an event and there's interpreters there, can I invite my brothers? And the answer is absolutely yes. You've organised interpreters for yourself, and if you're attending and you have deaf friends or family members that are attending, they are more than welcome to access that interpreter as well. An example might be a theatre show. I might be really excited to see a theatre show and I organise interpreting, and there'll be interpreters on stage, and I can say to my friends, hey, come on, I've organised an interpreter and I'll pay for it out of my NDIS package, and everyone else can attend and enjoy having the interpreter there. It's a nice memory to share. And then in the future, you may go to something that's paid for by one of your friends who you previously paid for interpreters for. So you can share that. One question that came up was, can I use NDIS interpreters for TAFE and University? As Paula mentioned earlier, TAFE and University have their own interpreter processes. They are responsible in providing interpreters. The NDIS will not pay for interpreters where there should already be interpreters there. So public hospitals, the government are already obligated to provide interpreting. They do provide funding to hospitals. But for private medical appointments, then yes, you can use interpreters using the NDIS, or local community courses. Yes, that's a different story. So big TAFEs and universities, it is their responsibility to provide interpreting. They have funding for that, likewise with hospitals. There's a question here as well that we've come across. So what if I want to use captioning instead of interpreting? You can decide whether or not you want VRI interpreting, captions, face-to-face interpreting. The funding all comes from the same area, so you can choose whatever best suits your needs. It's language access. Now, for those of you watching at home, do you have any other questions or comments? Please feel free to share them with us. There's a question here that we were asked in an information session. Is if I want to sell my home, can I get an interpreter? And like we said, for anything you need, you may be able to get interpreting. You may want to buy a car or sell your home, and you can organise interpreters to ensure that there is smooth communication. You might want to sell your house and have conversations with the real estate agent. You can get interpreters. Some people have done that in the past. They've gone to the travel agents and they've wanted to book flights for a holiday, and they've brought interpreters along with them to have those conversations. If you have NDIS funds and you have the hours in your package and you think that it will be extremely beneficial to have interpreters there, then you can. It's really important you do have that conversation with your planner. In the past, I went to a travel agent and they didn't tell me everything I needed to know, and the writing to each other took so long. I want to know everything, and with the interpreters, I'll get that, because a lot of NDIA planners are not experts about deafness or interpreting. They don't know what barriers that we face as deaf people, and it's important that you completely explain every single facet of your needs to ensure the NDIA planner can see the value in providing interpreters. Never assume that they understand what you're talking about. You really need to talk about your barriers, your frustrations, find where you find times where you're faced with limited information. Really explain all of that clearly to ensure they understand. And maybe you can explain, if there's an interpreter there, then my quality of life will improve because I can communicate, I can better understand people I'm talking to, and I can book all my flights and I can do everything clearly. In the past, you might say, oh, I've not done that. If I had interpreters, then it will have positive impacts, and you need to explain how and why it would be a positive outcome for yourself. So another question that's been asked in an information session is, how do I contact interpreting agencies if I want to book interpreters? So you can have a look on the website, you can Google all the different interpreting agencies, and you can contact all of them. An example is at Big Deaf we have Auslan Connection, so you can contact them using Skype, you can text, you can do it online. It's easy to do that, or you can organise it directly with an interpreter. Oh, there are some questions here that we haven't seen yet. So there's a question here. It says, are there lots of interpreting agencies, and how do I know who to contact? In Melbourne, there's 4 interpreting agencies that I'm aware of. We have Auslan Connections, Echo Interpreting, Auslan Services, and NABS. And there may be other smaller interpreting agencies out there for foreign spoken languages that they'd also do Auslan interpreting. But the easiest thing to do is to get online and do your research. Ask your friends who they usually use, who they're happy with. You can contact all of the agencies for different appointments. You may use one agency for medical interpreting, another agency for workplace. Quite a few questions here now. We're just going through them. There's a question here about, what if you're not happy with the service you've received from your interpreter and you realise, you notice that their skill set is not appropriate? If you book to an interpreter agency, then it's important to provide that feedback. Let them know you're not satisfied with the quality of service you've received, and then the agency can better manage that. If you book interpreters directly, then that's a conversation you'll have to have directly with that individual to try and improve the relationship and to better improve their working skills. Someone has asked about the AFL, the footy. They want an interpreter at the footy. If you are an avid footy fan and you want to talk to people about footy and it's something you really enjoy, then yes, that is something that is possible to be covered by the NDIS. It improves your engagement in the community. Like we said before, there's medical, community and learning, education, and that fits very well in the community category. Some people just feel that passionate about theatre, some people feel passionate like that about footy. It's really up to each individual. Another question here is, can you have family members booked for interpreting under the NDIS? It's a very interesting question. From what we have noticed, it looks like the NDIS says that no, family members cannot interpret for you and be paid by the NDIS. what we've read up on, it looks like no, it's not encouraged, but we'll do some more research to find out what the actual case is, and I'm happy to share more information with you further, because that is a bit of a grey area, and I want to ensure that we give you the right information. It is an interesting area of conversation. The NDIS just wants to prevent people from taking advantage of their family members and the system, but again, they also encourage choice and control. So if that's something you want, then it should be in your decision. There is a bit of a contradiction there. I do need to have a look more into that information, and I'll share more information shortly about that. You should be able to book what interpreter you want, but if you know that they are NASI accredited, you'll know that they've done the training, they've got the ethics, they're bound by their professional. If you just have someone who can sign but aren't qualified, the information may not be right. You need to really think about the quality of interpreting that you're accessing. Someone has asked a question here. A few times they've asked about getting a letter from the NDIS called an access request form. So the ARF form, or the access request form, that's what starts the process. So you need to fill in that form to explain who you are, what your disability may be, and you need to provide proof. If you do need any help filling out the access request form, please contact us here at VicDeaf, because it is a lengthy document and it will be very new to you. So if you do need help with your RAF form, please do contact us. You can contact us at ndis@vicdeaf.com.au, and we're happy to meet with you and Skype chat with you to go through that form. There is another question here that says, a problem is that they want to book interpreters, but it's hard if it is last minute. That is true, and that's a problem we're finding across the board. There is an interpreter shortage. There aren't a lot of interpreters out there. So it is good if you do know there is something, a special family event like a wedding or a doctor's appointment coming up, to book the interpreter as soon as you know. If something does happen last minute, it's still worthwhile contacting someone. Interpreters have cancellations and they may be able to fill their booking. You're right, it is hard, and there is an interpreter shortage. Everyone has funds now and everyone wants interpreting, but we don't have enough interpreters, so we do need to increase the pool of interpreters. There's a question here that says, if two people are deaf and want to book an interpreter, can they share the costs? So can they pay half out of each person's plan? Well, you might book an interpreter for 6 hours, and one person might book it for 3 hours, and then you might book it for the other 3 hours and then pay it like that. That is one way that you can overcome that sort of idea. From what the NDIA have said is that they don't like sharing. So if it's one invoice but paid by two separate people, they prefer that that's not the case. So you do need to think about workarounds. You're better off splitting the booking and doing 3 hours and 3 hours, and each individual can pay for both of those two different invoices. The email address again is ndis@vicdeaf.com.au. There's another question here that says, my daughter is hard of hearing. I'm wondering if I can organise someone to advocate to the NDIS for her, because she may not be able to have access to the NDIS. Yes, we have pre-planners who work in the team, like Daniel, myself, and other people who work here in our team. We're happy for you to contact us and for us to look into that further to see if your daughter is eligible. There are decibel requirements. You need to live in the right area. You need to be an Australian citizen. There are a number of conditions that will determine whether or not you are eligible. But please do contact us, and it's that same email address. I'll type it in shortly so you can refer to that email address later. I think we've got 1 minute left of tonight's session. So it looks like we've answered most of the questions that have been shared with us tonight. And we've got 61 people joining us now. Hopefully you are happy with the information you've received. We're more than happy for your feedback, and we will happy to do more sessions like this on different topics around the NDIS. It is the first time we're doing this tonight, and I think it's been a very valuable exercise, and it's worthwhile to get your feedback. So please enjoy your evening, and we'll see you another time. Thank you all so much. Good night.